All right, welcome to this week's live office hours. I'm mixing it up. I don't have the black shirt on today. I have the limited edition retreat shirt. It's pretty cool. It's
Nice.
got a cool back, but I thought I'd mix it up today. These shirts, for whatever reason, are just so comfortable. Um, we kind of geek out for sure on the swag side of things. But to kick this week off, we had something that we really wanted to talk about, and something I used to jam on a lot, especially with the Wholesale Made Easy podcast, is like how do you go about making decisions? And I think really your perspective on when you're making decisions is important, because the decision you make in any way, shape, or form is very subjective, right? You can't say that's a good or a bad decision. It really just depends on what you're optimizing for. But for a moment, let's assume that you're trying to build a scalable operation, right? You want to be doing tens of thousands of units per month in sales, multi-channel, all these things. The thing that I come back to, I actually stole from Ramit Sethi, who great guy in the personal finance space. And he has this thing of like, don't make $5 decisions, make $50,000 decisions. And the example he gives is everybody's in the personal finance world. It's like, hey, don't drink a $5 latte, make it at home. And he's like, listen, sure, but like that doesn't really matter. like, is that really going to save you like 50 grand over the course of forever? Sure. But the reality is you can make one decision, which is, could you negotiate your rent from, let's say, 2,500 to 2,000? That is a far more impactful decision on your personal finances, that one decision, than the $5 latte. So I kind of took the same philosophy and was like, all right, well, I want to make 30,000 unit decisions, not 30 unit decisions. And I think a lot of sellers get stuck in this space, which is really optimizing for the small things, right? It's just like you're overemphasizing these 10 units and you're like, oh, well, how do I increase it here and there? And you get one additional sale, but it took you 30 hours of your time. Like, not really worth it, right? And so my go-to in a lot of cases that explains this is like prep centers. So when I was doing wholesale, yeah, I can save money prepping myself, have it all come to my house. I could do it. But then I asked the question, how would I scale those operations from, let's say I'm doing, 500 units a month to 50,000 units a month? Well, could I scale it very easily? Or let me rephrase it. Can I process 50,000 units a month in the same amount of time and effort, if not less, than it's currently taking me to do 50 or 500 units a month? That's how I got on the prep center route, because I'm like, oh, well, if I send them 10,000 units or 50,000 units a month, to me, it doesn't matter. I'm just changing my order quantity, right? And so that's one good example. Now, are you paying more per unit to go the prep center route versus the do-it-yourself route? Sure, totally. But again, if we're operating from the lens of how do you scale and how are you able to handle super high volumes, these are kind of the trade-offs you have to consider. And maybe you don't want to do that, and that's fine too, right? And eventually that breaks too. The prep center thing starts to break because now it is too costly and you need to go from a variable cost to a fixed cost. And now we do go get a warehouse and all these things, right? But by sitting down and really thinking through every decision you're making and asking yourself variations of this question, which is like, how can I process or sell 50,000 units, the same amount of effort for me individually as 50 units or 500 units, you'll start to find interesting answers, and you'll make decisions based on scale, not necessarily based on what's immediately in front of you. And that's how you get a little bit more strategic. But that's kind of what I wanted to kick us off with. And obviously, it's office hours. So as everybody's jumping in here, go ahead and add whatever questions you have. We can talk about this. We can talk about Aura, the product, go in depth on strategy. But Casey, I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of this whole concept of making decisions that scale.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of like you said, honing in on your specific process, right? Like if you have a good process for a listing where you have 10, 20 units, whatever that looks like, how do you then multiply it without taking time away from more sourcing, other things that you're trying to do? So that's when looking into, those prep centers, maybe hiring different assistants for whether it's managing a different portion so you can focus more on scaling that inventory management or whatever that looks like. And yeah, I think like you said at the beginning, it really depends on what you're trying to optimize for. If you're trying to scale, like what are you trying to scale? Is it margins? Then repricing is great. If you're trying to scale like number of units, that's where you start to get into the inventory management, looking at warehouse prep centers, all of those moving pieces. So I do think it's about kind of zooming in a little bit on what you want to scale and then kind of zooming out in terms of looking how would you go about doing that.
Yeah.
And obviously, as we know, the Amazon space itself is a very communal space. So I would recommend, I don't have any off the top recommendations for online communities, but when you do get to that point where you're looking to scale, I would recommend reaching out to some online forums or communities, seeing how other folks have gone about it. It's always good to hear the good and then the not so good to know maybe potential things that you can avoid. So yeah, scaling is always tough in any aspect of things, but I think trying to focus on scaling one specific metric, and then once you have that optimized, scaling a different metric and moving down the line like that.
Yeah, and we do this internally too. So actually, the way we've structured our customer support / success team, like all the operations, is designed to handle very large numbers of users as easy as it would be just a few hundred. Like, you want to speak to kind of how like our philosophy, like that conversational funnel that we use from Intercom, and kind of how that lends itself to this perspective?
Yeah. So essentially we try to have, I'm going to forget the actual names of each level, but essentially like the self-service help where, hey, I have this question, or our AI chat bot is actually called Finn, is not our colleague Finn, but is actually the name of the platform. They'll self-serve based on your question, a potential solution for you so that you can hopefully find it on your own. That's where also that knowledge base comes in, having a library of articles. So you don't necessarily have to come ask a question. You can type in the search bar, find that answer there. And then that next level down is going to be where we can help kind of quickly provide that answer, whether it's a common question or an in-depth question. And then as it gets more specific, that's where we get more hands-on. But specifically trying to give you folks the quickest answer as possible with those self-serve articles and those kind of served up suggestions in terms of, hey, is this what you're looking for? This might be the solution to that. And at times there are numbers of different number of people in chat, and we're working with a few different people at once. So we always do appreciate your patience with those responses. But we try to shoot for under 10 minutes for that first response. And then depending on the issue, that next response may be a little bit longer or shorter, depending on the issue. So that's kind of how we look at support, trying to help you folks get the best results, but also get the answer as quick as possible.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. This is pervasive, right? This is a philosophy. This is how you think about solving problems. You can apply it to all areas of life. And there's a few philosophies that I think in hindsight have worked really well in different industries. And a good example here is I'm really nerding myself right now, right? You know how people are like, I'm aging myself, I'm nerding myself. Here's my level of nerdiness. Lean manufacturing principles. You're like, what the heck does this have to do with software? What the heck does this have to do with Amazon? I'll explain it. The Toyota production system, it's called TPS. So the company Toyota, like the car manufacturer in Japan, was struggling to scale. They're like, we're pumping things out, but the quality is crap. What do we do? And the then owner, it's been a lineage of the family, came in and said, let's find a way to make this work. And so he developed the Toyota production system, now readily known as lean manufacturing. That kind of philosophy, you're like, okay, it's cool. How do you find a way to basically like make things clean, make it easy to do? Like, how do you basically take chaos and try to organize it? Which, like, I have ADHD, so like I can struggle with that a lot myself. And so you can find these interesting philosophies and then apply it to your Amazon business, which is exactly what I did, right? I would sit down and say, okay, well, I'm not going to batch things in the way you would initially think about it. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go end to end for one thing. And I'm going to reduce the things, right? So how can I simplify things? How can I remove things that really don't matter? How can I sequence them in such a way that makes it easier for me, right? When you sit down and you say, here's my workflow, have you really thought about optimizing that sequence of events to make it easier? When you go to sit down and submit a purchase order doing wholesale, or whenever you sit down to source OA products, have you sequenced the set of tasks or even clarify what they even are so that you sit down and you know exactly what step 1 is and what step 7 is? That kind of stuff is really fun. You can apply it at home, certainly, which that's the third level of nerdiness, I would say. But I guess like my point here is start to kind of read outside of the Amazon space and look at interesting things that may not initially register as applicable here, and then try to apply it. I think a lot of being a seller from a competitive standpoint, how do you adapt? It's like, this is how, right? You find information that is readily available in other industries that are considered best practices, and then you apply them here and see if you can apply them. And if they work, great. Now you're unique and you've done something different. Even with wholesale back in the day, I kind of realized what I did was not wholesale, it was sales. So if that's the case, let me just go learn the best practices of sales and then apply it here. And all of a sudden things started to work, right? So again, change of perspective is kind of the philosophy so far in this call, which is just how do you create different lenses to view problems through that makes it easier for you to solve them in potentially creative and unique ways. But yeah, I dig this stuff a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, think about customer service and customer support. After joining the team, I noticed like different businesses or different industries, how they do it. Like now, like whenever you go to a fast food place, it's rare you see someone order from the counter. They go up to the kiosk and make their order. And there are a couple people who don't know how to use it. Will walk up and order in person. So that's kind of where I was like, oh, that's kind of like our self-serve articles. And when people need more help, they come directly to us. So yeah, it's interesting just trying to shift that perspective. And though it may not, like you said, be directly applicable, how can the theme or the philosophy transfer over into your day-to-day or your business operations there?
Yeah, exactly. It is funny when you start doing support, especially with us, you start to go to other teams and other software and be like, let me check how they do support real quick. And you realize most of the time it's not great, but sometimes when they do a great job, you're like, hey, thumbs up. That was pretty awesome. A little bit of positive feedback for you there. Yeah, I love that. Love that. Awesome. So again, as you're jumping in here, please ask any questions you have. We're happy to dive deep into any kind of topic. We can dive deep into Aura specifically. Any how do you do X, Y, and Z? This session is really designed to help our current users and potential users get to a point of clarity of how do I do certain things. Anything that you're not necessarily clear on, we're happy to go in depth on, of course, from the product side of things, but also just the seller side of things. If you're like, where do I go to learn this? We probably can point you in the right direction. So definitely important there. Awesome. So as we're waiting for these to come through, one thing is fees. Fees are starting to change again. It's the ever evolving. I like how the community is very much like, oh no, the fees are changing. It's like they change every year. Like at this point, just assume they will change. You might not necessarily know exactly when, but they will. So something to keep in mind there. I think that's coming up here in the next few days, actually. So definitely something to be mindful of. But Casey, anything that's top of mind for you, or any patterns that you're noticing right now?
In terms of things that are top of mind, I know a lot of folks are coming in being excited to use the Maven AI strategy. That's great. That's going to optimize for just that best combo of velocity and margin for you folks. Just one note, I know a lot of folks think, hey, it's not targeting the buy box. Why is this? It's just not designed to specifically target that buy box. If you are looking to do that, I will recommend our buy box targeting strategy that will exclusively target the buy box regardless of who's in there. And then I guess the other piece would be using potential max prices with Maven. Though they are not required, you may want to put some max prices in there, as Maven will test various price points, trying to get the most margin there or see where it can, and then learn. The longer it's applied to a listing, the more intelligent it will become. But sometimes it'll initially test a higher range. I know some folks have min and maxes set in Seller Central that'll cause a potential high pricing error. So if you're worried about that or thinking about those things or running into that issue, I would recommend either having the min and maxes aligned between Aura and Seller Central, or removing those max and min prices on the Seller Central side so you don't run into those potential errors.
Nice.
That's come up a few times for folks mostly just getting started, and it's great to see that they're jumping right into the AI strategy. But we do typically recommend some sort of blend between that and rules based. But those are just some things to look out for if you're looking to dive deeper into Maven and take advantage of that.
Nice. Yeah, Maven, you kind of have to shift your perspective, right? This is something I've been talking about a lot on the lives that we've been doing, podcasts, stuff like that, which is like, it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation when you're saying I'm going from, let's say, 100% rule based to 100% Maven. You really have to pause and think about like what is different here, because the one thing that I see that actually kind of hinders Maven in a lot of cases is, let's say you're setting your mins using a role-based strategy at 30% ROI. And like that totally works. It's great. But then you convert over to Maven and you also set the mins at 30% ROI and the performance is not quite there. The thing you have to keep in mind is Maven needs a little bit more room to test things, right? To be a little bit more strategic. So I remember when we first came out with the beta, we had a user like 300 grand a month in sales. So like decent volume, right? Did this wholesale 100% over from role-based to Maven. It's like, I'm not really seeing the performance. What's up? So we went in, I was like, I bet you it's kind of restricted. So what we did is we actually halved the minimum ROI value from that 30% to a 15%. We're like, let's just try it for a week. Let's see what happens. Because our theory here is that it's limited. And sure enough, within a few hours, things kicked off. Like margins up, sales volumes up. It's looking great. And so when you're looking at Maven, think about, and it really like ask yourselves, am I giving it too many limitations? Because if we are, we're going to restrict that performance. That's one of the reasons why Maven doesn't have all these crazy settings. It's like that just adds a lot of complexion for you. Nobody really wants a lot of that complexity, but it allows us to be more strategic, handle more complexities for you without you having to really like get in there and tinker with it. Which, listen, if you're in there and tinkering with your repricing tool every day, that's probably a problem because you have better use cases of your time, certainly. So as you're making that transition, and we have a lot of new sellers coming in too, which has been phenomenal. So a lot of people just coming, to the table being like, what is repricing? How do I get started? What are the best practices here? Because it can be overwhelming. I remember when I first got started as a seller, it was very overwhelming. I mean, I probably put it off for a few years, if I'm being honest, because one, it just felt like that's for the larger sellers that are at scale versus, little old me, so to speak. And that's just not true. Like you absolutely need it. You can still get value from it at a very, early stage of the business, but also I was like, I'm just so worried about messing things up. Like you hear horror stories of tanking down to a penny and you're like, I don't want to do that. Right. And so, a lot of sellers, especially newer sellers, have this kind of risk equation in their head of, well, the opportunity sounds kind of nice, but the probability of me messing this up seems higher. So I'm just going to negate that. Please don't do that. Every time, and Casey, you can speak to this too, is every time a seller has put it off and joins and gets up and running, they're like, why did I waste so much time? I could have done this 8 months, 12 months, 18 months ago. Do you see those kind of comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of newer sellers who are coming in, and then I'm sure they're coming from a different setup where they're either manually repricing or dealing with the pitfalls of not repricing at all. And then once they're set up and up and running, they're like, wow, like I can't believe that this is how easy it is. I know a little while ago, one of our head engineer, James, and I jumped on a call with someone who was having an issue and just talking to him like, hey, like, how did you find us? He's like, yeah, a friend referred me to you guys. And I was thinking like, wow, why haven't I been doing this for so long? I could have been a 6-figure seller by now, if not repricing by hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting to see people kind of live that impact and have so much more free time open up for inventory management. Or this specific guy was just trying to set up one rule so we could go grab dinner with his family, prioritizing the things that are most important to you there.
Right.
So yeah, it's always interesting to see that. And for anyone who's hesitant to reprice and afraid of potential errors or things like that, you don't have to reprice your whole catalog at once. You can set a rule up for a handful of listings, see how it performs, and go from there. So definitely something that, when done correctly, can free up so much of your time and also impact your bottom line pretty heavily in a positive manner as well.
Yeah, it's a good call out. even if you're considering transitioning from one tool to the other, it can feel very black and white, very like binary. I have to shut everything off here and enable everything over here. Not necessarily true. Obviously you should never run two repricing tools actively on the same SKU or same listing. But what you can do is, like you said, you can, let's say we're going to take a quarter or half of my SKUs and toggle them on here, toggle them off here, and then just kind of compare and see what we prefer, and if it makes sense to kind of go wholesale over. That kind of risk mitigation strategy, I think, makes a lot of sense for anything you're doing, right? Whether you're like buying inventory with wholesale, like, yeah, maybe don't buy 1,000 units, start with 25, see how that goes, and then scale it up exponentially, right? We'll go from 25 to 50 to 100 to 200, so on and so forth. In addition to that, with Maven, we've had a lot of people be like, hey, like, Maven sounds awesome, I'm ready to test this out. Do I just flip everything over? I'm like, I mean, you can, right? But like, maybe get comfortable with it first, right? Take 25% of your most active SKUs, throw those on it, see what you like, see what you don't like, and then kind of tweak it from there, right? Because, no strategy is designed for every single SKU. Maven is the model that we're trying to get to that point where it gets as close to handling the vast amounts of complexities and scenarios that exist. But it's still V1, right? It's like, we're not quite at that point where it's like 100%. I think in an ideal world, I hope it never gets to 100% because there's always things evolving and changing in the world, which as it should, right? So it's a good perspective to have if you're kind of hesitant of making any kind of changes. Just partition it out a little bit. Let's see here. Steven, good question. How important is it for me to input my COGS? I use Maven and set my min and just the repressor do its thing. Why would I need to input my COGS? I use other tools to manage COGS. Great question, actually. I wrote a blog post about this last week, goor.com/blog, talking about how do you properly set mins and maxes. And I talk about basically like how it's not great to manually set these. And I'll break this down. Min prices have everything to do with you and your buy costs, right? They're so subjective to you. Max prices have nothing to do with you, right? So manually setting max prices, you're either going to set it too high or too low, period. And it should change, right? I think this is where a lot of sellers get stuck is they look at a specific period of time and they say, okay, well, I have this data in front of me as I'm listing it. This min and max makes sense. Set it, forget it. That's fine for like 2 days. But if you're going to hold inventory for weeks, months, at a time, what is a appropriate max price? Like the peak price will change by season, will change by week, will change as your competition changes, as the demand itself changes. And so manually setting that doesn't really work. Automatically setting that also doesn't work if we're doing that based on your COGS. However, min prices, I rarely recommend setting these manually, and I'll explain why. It comes down to convenience. I know, like, what? Crazy. Convenience is great. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say you set 100% of your listings, let's say you got 1,000 SKUs, right? You're going to set 100% of these to 30%, or let's say 15% ROI. That's how you're calculating your min. Well, do fees change? Yeah. Do your COGS change? Sometimes. But do you change? Yeah. What I mean by that is sometimes the min price you're willing to accept is different in Q1 versus Q4. And yeah, it's a big gap in time, right? But the reality is sometimes you're willing to take less money, right? So if we think about the life cycle of a product for every single time, every single SKU you list for you individually, you're going to be very conservative when you first come in stock, and then you're going to become more aggressive as time goes on. Why? Opportunity costs exist. Your money's tied up. You got long-term storage fees kind of, starting to, come around the corner there. So you have to start moving it fast. So there are cases where you have 30 of these SKUs. Well, do you really want to go and adjust and recalculate your min prices manually? No, it's so not worth the effort. Instead, you do two things in the scenarios I just covered. Either one, you just change that 30 value in your strategy to 15 and hit save. You're done. That took less than 10 seconds. Or you change it from strategy A to strategy B, because let's say you don't want to do it for 100%, right? And so that level of convenience doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but as you're scaling up, it becomes a big deal because you're managing so many different things, and it's just so much easier to think through the lens of I use profit margin or ROI. Here's the minimum I'm willing to accept. Do that work for me. I don't need to do it. So COGS do matter for that reason because we can't calculate an ROI profit. We can't calculate an automatic min value or max value for that matter outside of Maven without COGS, because that's kind of how we calculate any of those values. Now, secondary to that, but just as important, is the analytics. I know, like, hey, like I can see my top level, but you really want to see what's your average ROI? What's your average profit margin? Because if you're not tracking these KPIs, you don't know if they're getting better or worse. It's one thing to be like, well, my sales are going up, but is that good, right? Because if we increase your sales but massively decrease your ROI, I don't think that's really good, right? And we kind of want a mixture of both. So if we see that our sales are going up and our profit margin or our ROI is holding steady, that's a very good situation. I like that, right? And so the more data you can have, and really the accuracy of the data being high, the more of that you can have, the better, because it lets you peer into what is true, what is reality, and now you can make really important decisions based on that. So should you add your cost of goods sold, your buy cost to Aura? Absolutely. And we got some awesome updates coming for you guys in the next coming weeks that will make that way easier. But certainly worth the effort there. Casey, anything you want to add on to that?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it. Yeah, especially if you're having those calculations those minimum and maximum prices being auto calculated. You will just want to make sure those costs are accurate. Specifically for FBM sellers, you want to make sure any shipping fees that you incur on listings are included in those costs, just so that Aura can account for them when doing those manual calculations. So that would be just the one note I would put on there. And that does also apply to any inbound shipping fees to Amazon. If you want to include those in the costs, you just want to add that to the cost field for that specific listing so that those ROI and margin calculations are done accurately for you.
Perfect. David has a follow-up here looking at repricing at ROI. What is your recommendation for setting your min? That's a tough one. It's a loaded one. One thing I would recommend is actually reading that blog post that we recently released this Monday. So there's a link right there where I kind of break down how to think about it. How do you approach it? In terms of specifically setting like an ROI min, it really does come down to what are you willing to accept? Like the lowest, not just like in an ideal world, I'd make at least 30, or I buy at 30%. What you buy at is irrelevant. It's what are you willing to go down to? And is that realistic, right? I think sometimes you can say, well, I buy at 30%, but you're not factoring in certain things. And actually you're only going to get 10%. That's the only thing that's actually reasonable for the inventory that you buy. So you also have to be reasonable, right? Like if we're calculating, let's say at 15% ROI, where is that relative to the buy box? Is it right next to it? That's probably too high, right? And even if you're like, well, I want 30%, sounds great, but like you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunity. You should lower that probably closer to 15%. So I like to just kind of quick check myself of where is that automatically calculated min price relative to the buy box kind of on average, and does it give me enough range to do what I need to do? And if it's too tight, then I'm going to have some problems. I'm going to have a lack of performance simply from that perspective. Casey, you kind of dive into a lot of this yourself as well, right?
Yeah. So in terms of setting those mins and maxes, like you said, you don't want them too tight, so it has a range, but you don't also want them to be too wide. So then you're not being priced higher than the majority of other sellers on that listing. So it is kind of finding a balance between, like you said, what would be acceptable for your min. And then obviously your max price is more so relevant to the actual listings performance. Like obviously you'd love to sell at 400% ROI, but are you actually going to get a sale at 400% ROI?
Right.
Or ROI? Probably not. So I know I was talking to a user this morning or yesterday, can't quite remember, but they were just asking like any recommendations for setting a max. And I said, yeah, if you're setting a $20 item or an item that sells typically at $20, maybe make that minimum $17, make the max 23. So you have kind of a tight range there. But then if you have an item that sells at 200, maybe you want to do 175, 225. So as that general price of sales for a specific listing kind of goes up, I would recommend kind of slowly starting to expand that min and max range so that as those price changes come through, the range that is repriceable within, for lack of the better term, kind of matches the size or bigger price of that specific
Yeah.
listing.
Nice. Yeah. And one thing I'll share my screen here just so we can we can we can kind of highlight this because I think it is important. Is that the right one? Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So here's that blog post that we're talking about here. I just want to highlight, like, whenever somebody's like, "Oh, go read the blog post," it's always like, "Great, I have to go sift through all this craziness." We organized it very clearly because we get a lot of similar questions. Why does it matter? Why does it matter? It shouldn't. It does. And we break down exactly why that matters. And to Casey's point about setting those tighter versus, sometimes it makes sense to set those tight versus very wide, right? And this is where you have to think about, am I using AI or rule based? If I'm rule based using something like the oscillation strategy, which I highlight here, it actually needs to be tighter because the strategy we're using here is very different than if we're using AI, in which case we need the vast majority of range. The more range, the better for AI. The less range, the better typically for an oscillation-based strategy. And again, I talk about, and I already kind of highlighted this, but I talk about some of the pitfalls of manually setting either of these because that is so, so important. A lot of sellers go, well, it's not a big deal. I just set it when I buy it or when I list it. But you're not realizing that things change so rapidly, especially as your SKU count increases. And so if you're understanding how things are better when they're dynamic, you're going to understand that me manually setting either of these is actually locking me out of a lot of opportunity in theory. And then we talk about how do you actually set these automatically in a way that rationally makes sense. So we talk about that a bit. Now, your min price, again, how do I set it perfectly myself? It's so subjective. Some sellers are like, I buy at 100% ROI and I'm willing to go down to 30 and nothing less. And I never have things get stuck. Perfect. That's fine. Other sellers, have to go down to 5% minimum ROI. Some sellers, and I've seen this work really well actually, is they set everything to 0% ROI. Why? They want the most range possible. And wherever the market goes is where the market goes. They care about velocity. They care about moving things quickly. We tested this in our demo account, actually, kind of smaller scale, but we said, hey, everything use Maven, put it all at 0% ROI minimum. Margin didn't really tank. Obviously there's things that started to move faster than previously because, again, it's got more range. So I think it comes down to, like, how are you thinking about the business from a sales perspective, right? What's your philosophy there? Do you want to move things faster or slower? Are you in the kind of flipping mentality or the volume mentality? Those are very different things. Some people, somewhat like myself, go, I'm not willing to wait for the market to come back to my ideal price. And not to say that that's right or wrong. It's just a different subjective perspective. But I'm like, wherever the market's at, it's where the market's at, right? Like, let's maximize it. I want to maximize profit, but I also want velocity. I want capital coming back to me. I want to be churning things, right? Like avoiding all these long-term storage fees. So I just wanted to highlight, like, how this is broken down because it can feel super overwhelming, but we can break it down very easily for a lot of people. So hopefully that helps. Steven, thank you. I switched over from a different repricer and I'm extremely happy with Aura. Love to hear that. That's exciting. Hopefully you got an onboarding session or talk with Casey. Increases the experience. That's for sure. Let's see here. See, Prince has a big one here. Amazon makes your items available as soon as it can, and that means your offer will at first have a longer handling time instead of a normal 2-day Prime shipping. It will remain that way while your items are in FC transfer, etc. Since Amazon probably won't rotate you in the buy box with a longer handling time, it probably doesn't make sense for you to be aggressive with repricing at the beginning. Does Maven take your longer handling time into account when deciding how aggressively to reprice? Yes, it does. It's less about the handling time specifically, more the status. So if we're looking at your inventory status and we see, okay, you have none available. So we break down your inventory as deeply as we need to, right? If you're in 13 different statuses for the same SKU, we'll show you all 13. What we care about is, do you have any that are fulfillable? If you have one that is fulfillable, awesome, we're going to get at it. If none are fulfillable in their FC transfer and all that stuff, what Maven attempts to do is basically raise that price, right? Because what we want to do is we actually want to come in at the highest possible price so that when we do go live, we're not pulling the buy box down. And why this is important is a lot of sellers will list at, let's say the buy box is at 25, you list at 25. But by the time you get checked in and become fulfillable, the buy box is at 28. Well, you went live at 25. Guess where the buy box went? It went to 25. So you lost that $3, that margin, simply for no reason, right? Which like just sucks. So instead, what we do is we place you as high as we can. And again, if you're using something like Maven, there's that dynamic auto max calculation that we're doing here, right? So that can even fluctuate a little bit too if it needs to. So I agree, you should not come in very aggressive. If you're in a pending state, there's no value in coming in aggressive. There's only potential downsides, in my opinion. So I would err on the sense of being conservative, which is what Maven is essentially designed to do. So hopefully that helps. But Casey, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dylan, on rules-based strategies, when there are no fulfillable units, rules-based will treat those as being out of stock. So it would then default to that last section, I believe, in Pursuit, where it'll be, what would you like to do when your listing's out of stock? You can have it stay at the same price, stay at your min, go to your max. So if there are no fulfillable units, like you were mentioning before, and you have that set to go to your max price, that listing will be held at your max price till one of those units becomes fulfillable. Then that repricing will resume based on those strategy settings there.
Yeah, exactly. That's very true. And again, this is why max prices matter, right? Because it gives you an upper bound to target that doesn't make you uncompetitive. You know, early days of repricing, people will be like, I just set it to $999, $1,000. Kind of didn't matter back in the day because you weren't really as strategic as you need to be now. So now, by having the critical variables in place, it allows us to create things with AI, with strategies that are incredible and high performant is the thing that really matters here. So going to your max price when out of stock sounds awesome, but how are you calculating your max price, right? If we're doing it automatically based on cost, not ideal. If we're manually setting it, probably a little bit better because we're being more intentional. But again, we're probably setting it too low or too high. However, if we're using something like Maven that's dynamically calculating this thing, it can change, right? It's not just go to $30. It's $30 makes sense right now, but the market just changed. Maybe $32 makes sense, so we'll raise it, right? Maybe we need to lower it too, right? And so that's where you really have to think about how you do these things and why they matter, because it starts to add up very quickly. See, Guy Harris here. Do you plan to implement any workflows or strategies that take into consideration inventory age? For example, 0 to 45 days, price conservatively for profit, 46 to 90 days, price aggressively to move inventory. Yeah, this is something we're talking a lot about, actually. You know, there's a few different perspectives on this that we could go. One is the workflows route, where you say, hey, you know, the event trigger is age of inventory is less than X, assign strategy A. If it's greater than X, assign strategy B, and we can, you know, kind of basically teeter-totter between the strategies as we need to. One's more conservative, one's more aggressive. Another perspective on this, though, is using Maven, right? Like you basically saying, hey, I'm willing to play awesome in this range, but once we get over this day of age, I want to move my inventory and I want you to be more aggressive. I see both worlds existing really well. I really like the idea of adding this to Maven and just Maven being considerate of what's the age of inventory right now. And like, let's get aggressive, but what happens when it goes back down? I think a lot of sellers don't think about the fact that, you know, if you have multiple shipments coming in of the same SKU, well, what can happen is, one batch goes over that 46 days, right? So it goes to 48 days as an example, and we become aggressive, and then it falls back on average. Well, do we want to stay aggressive? Not really, right? And so that comeback, right, that going from aggressive back to conservative really matters. And so if we could bake that into Maven as an example, that gets really interesting, because a lot of that kind of, you don't have to build the workflows, right? You're just like, here's the day and like, you do it for me. So we are thinking about that, but age of inventory is a great one. Let's see, second question here from Guy. Second question, I've noticed in some cases that while Maven isn't penny undercutting a listing, it's simply matching another penny cutter. Any way for Maven to know when to stop matching a penny cutter in attempts to keep a product profitable? Yeah, Casey, you want to hit this one? This one's kind of fun.
Yeah, so in terms of how the logic of how Maven works, it really focuses on how your competition is reacting to your repricing methods. So if Maven's on a listing and it's going 1 penny lower, 1 penny lower, and the competition is matching you to kind of or not matching the price, rather matching that strategy of continuing to price below, Maven's going to recognize that, and to avoid tanking the listings price down to your minimum, Maven will then adjust to just match that price. At that point, obviously, a lot of other factors come into play, whether you're going to be in the buy box or not. But essentially, that just is there to protect your margins, making sure, hey, let's not just have a race to the bottom here. Let's hold strong and just let the listing play out as it would normally. And then, kind of alternatively, if you flip that on its head, if it recognizes that, hey, it is matching your price, or sorry, I get confusing myself there. If it continues to, if it's recognized your pricing under, it'll match, and then kind of vice versa. If it's recognizing that it's matching, it will try to cut underneath. I believe I have that correct. Dylan, you may have to color in the lines
Yeah,
a little bit there.
It basically depends on the scenario. It depends on the optimal price, right? So when you're thinking about Maven's designed to get you, and ideally you and the buy box, to what's called the optimal price. It's an actual calculation, right? So balance between sales velocity and profitability. So just because they're undercutting doesn't necessarily mean we will, right? It depends on that competitor. It depends on where we are relative to the optimal price. It depends on other competitors too, right? So that's where you kind of have to take a step back, because the way Maven reprices isn't pure logic in the sense of like, if this, then do that kind of a thing, which is very rule based, right? There are more second order behaviors, more strategic behaviors that's going to do that. You might be like, that feels kind of wrong, but then wait 5 minutes and you're like, oh, okay, I see why I did that, right? Where rule based strategies are very much like, if this, go there, and like that's kind of defined as success for the most part. AI models like Maven, it's more strategic. It's really positioning to a certain degree, right? And so it's not just what was the most recent price change. It's kind of taking a zooming out is what I'm trying to say. You got to zoom out and be like, what's the behavioral trend here? That's kind of what I tend to look at, versus just the individual, well, here's the exact price change. That doesn't really tell me much anymore, right? Like I kind of have to look at like probably the last hour and like, okay, I kind of see where it's going. I see who we're targeting. I see kind of their behaviors. I see what our behaviors are doing. And sometimes we're going to test things, right? Because maybe we can match them. They'll start to match us because we're not repricing below. Sometimes that's not the case, and we're going to reprice below anyways, and we're going to pull up, right? The level of complexity to Maven, I think, is very much something to consider, because it's hard to say like exactly here's why. It's like depends, really just depends. Let's see here. See, Sean, adding on to the prior question, there are really 3 levels, correct? Does Maven handle 1 and 2 differently? 1, prime eligible; 2, non-prime fulfillable; and 3, non-fulfillable. Casey, you want to hit that?
I'm actually a little fuzzy on that one myself. That's a good question, Sean. I'll let you take that one, Dylan.
Yeah. So if I'm reading this correctly, because I see the transfer parentheses, I'm assuming what you mean is different fulfillable states. So let me just triple check my assumptions here. Non-fulfillable. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case. Okay. So basically, like you are either fulfillable or non-fulfillable in a very general sense, right? So that's one thing. Then there are different statuses in each of those buckets, right? There could be a fulfillable. Really, it's kind of just fulfillable. Once you break down into like the non-fulfillable, all those craziness, you're still not fulfillable. So we're not necessarily going to treat it differently depending on the status. We're still going to look at go to your max price, all that stuff. So if you're inbound versus FC transfer, we're not really doing anything different there, because it doesn't really matter. You're still unfulfillable at that point, right? And so what we're trying to do is say you're not fulfillable by at least 1 unit. Let's position you well enough so that when that does change, because we know that it will change based on the unfulfillable statuses, you're in a good position once that does happen. So hopefully that answers it. Yeah. I think we read that right. We'll see here. So, Guy here, do we know the threshold for when Maven switches to protect the price by matching instead of undercutting? We talk in after a 10% tank, 25% tank. Not really how we're approaching it, solving that problem, because it's hard to say. Like, it's not just a. By the time it's dropped 10%, is in my opinion, you're already well too deep into like a price tanking situation. So what we're really doing is we're trying to avoid that to happen. Period. So instead of looking at like that trend necessarily, you can kind of look at each individual competitor and say like, okay, if this were to continue, where would that lead? Let's avoid that, right? So even, and again, you have to keep in mind, we're optimizing the behavior to get your price in the buy box to the optimal price, which typically tends to be slightly higher than the current buy box because you have competition, which is going to compress it down, right? So sometimes we're going to push down to come up. Sometimes we can just go straight up and people follow us. Like it all depends is what I'm trying to say. I know that's not like the easiest answer here. I wish I could get you a perfect flow chart, but it really just depends. And so it's less about like there's a threshold and more just what are the behaviors of the competition and then where are we trying to get ourselves to? And then based on all that, what do we need to do? Anything you want to add on to that, Casey?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I would assume that it wouldn't go as far as doing a 10 or 25% tank of the whole listing.
Yeah.
I feel like it would more so gauge based off the number of price changes and the number of times it's been undercut for recognizing that, but not fully positive. I think your explanation was a little bit more succinct.
That's good to hear. It did not feel succinct from my perspective, so that's good. Guy, glad. Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider, is what we're trying to succinctly say. There's a lot there for sure, and yeah. So I think whenever you're talking about a strategy or AI model, like what is it designed to do? That for sure matters the most, right? Because if it's designed to do something that you don't want, like let's say you're like, oh, I really want to liquidate. You should not use Maven. It's not designed to liquidate your inventory. So from that perspective, it would not be a success or high performing based on that criteria. So yeah, understanding that really helps add a lot of clarity as to like, what is it doing and why is it doing it? Understanding that desired outcome, that's what's going to help provide a lot more clarity for everybody. Let's see here. Awesome. Happy to see that got it or is doing a good job on my trial so far. Love hearing that, Sean. That's awesome. See DG here. Have both MFN and FBA listings for the same SKU repricing at the same time. Amazon doesn't like the MFN offer undercutting the FBA listing and will often suppress the listing when that happens. Is there any way to tie the two repricing structures together? Not the way we model it, because we try to isolate at this. We do look at the specific SKU level, but what we're not doing is basically saying you have two different SKUs. How do they correlate with one another? That doesn't happen as often, to be honest. But I kind of see that scenario being with one is FBA, one is merchant fulfilled. What we tend to recommend is you take one lead, because when you think about like why are sellers doing this, it's really like your FBA is the lead offer because it's FBA, but then you have a merchant fulfilled just in case something like your FBA sells out. You still technically have offers, you still have inventory, and like you have really good margins on that because of the lack of FBA fees. So what we've been recommending is pick your lead and basically like, it's kind of changed with Maven. With rule-based, we would basically say like your lead FBA offer should follow like an oscillation strategy kind of thing, and then your merchant fulfilled should basically just follow. It's not aggressive. It's literally just matching and keeping up with you. So there's still activity, but it's not trying to get sales necessarily. It's really just positioned for that in the case that it would need to. With Maven, it's a little bit different. That's a good question, actually. Yeah, you got my gears turning now. This is kind of interesting. I want to say like right now, no is the answer, but as I'm thinking about it, I could see a few potential scenarios that would be cool. So here's what I would recommend. I would recommend, because there's a lot here that I think is cool, add that as a feature request. So feedback.goer.com, you can see what's already there. You can upvote, add comments, add clarity, add your own, of course. Add that there, with as much detail as you want. What would that look like for you? What do you want it even to do? There's a lot of Yeah, you got my gears turning, which is good. But I'm like, oh man, that's a tough one actually. So yeah, great question though. Let's see here. Guy Harris, any way to quickly determine the profit of a listing based on the minimum pricing? Like, could I hover over the min price and see the profit? Casey, you're shaking your head. Do you want to?
Yeah. So for any auto-calculated figures in your strategy settings there, Guy, you can obviously have Maven calculate your min max prices based on your cost field. If that is the case and you're looking at a listing page, you can hover over that auto-calculated min or max, and it will give you a full breakdown as to the profit, the margin, ROI percentage, all those good juicy details that you're looking for. For manually set mins, since Aura does not have insight into like the specific structure of that, I do not believe if you hover over it at that point, you'd get the breakdown. Yeah, but as you can see, Dylan showing us here, if you hover over,
they're set at 0% ROI, so that's why you're not seeing it here.
Okay, but yeah, as you can see, hovering over any of those prices there, you will see kind of that breakdown of profit, ROI, fees associated with that specific price point as well. You just won't see that for any manually entered min or maxes there, Guy.
Yeah, so you can see here I added a 20% ROI, so we see that exact breakdown here.
And if you scroll down as well there, Dylan, you can see on the, right there, the profit or fees section, that'll be the breakdown for the current price of the listing. On the right side, that's obviously going to be your min and max thresholds.
Yeah. And something cool to highlight, granted, this is a slow moving item. This is a real item, by the way. The min's set to 0% ROI on Maven, and it's at 43.70 right now. So that's kind of cool. So, right. So it's like, again, going back to our earlier conversation about setting wider ranges. This is just a very slow moving one because we're coming out of Yeti season. But yeah, just want to highlight that. I think it's kind of cool. But yeah, you could definitely do that, Guy. Great question. And yes, that's correct. So it is on the specific listings detail page. However, you can do this on the listings page too. So let me pull this up here. And let me add, do I have it on? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. You can do this on the listings page. So where you're seeing all of your specific listings. So let me zoom out here. So I'm just doing a quick filter on the Yetis specifically. And again, you can customize this as much as you need. But if I go to the min price, this is automatically calculating. There's that 0% ROI, but we did that 20% to get the point across. You can still hover here and see that there as well. So anywhere you're seeing that hover state, you could definitely do that, which is pretty great. A great question there. I like when we get to cover these smaller like quality of life things because it's very impactful. You know, we're like, oh, I wish I could do this. And you're like, oh, I can. Okay, cool. Like all of a sudden things get a little bit more exciting. See, right. So only when automated can you see that. I believe that's correct here. Let me triple check here. I believe that's correct.
Yeah, I believe that is the case.
Yes,
won't
be
able to see it on those manual figures there.
Yeah, that is indeed the case. Yeah, exactly. Right. I was like, dang, I really miss having that. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of little things that are quality of life things that I think are worth kind of highlighting here. Just real quick, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to show. Oh, we got Big C in here. I like that. Big C, you're late, man. What's up? I appreciate you jumping in here. Okay, so we're back on this specific listing pages, SKU page. There's a few things that are just amazing on this page, right? You have different hover states. So we showed that min price. We showed the current profit margin ROI, based on our current price as that is changing. Quantity, not as exciting here because there's only one and it's fulfillable, but that can change a lot. And in lieu of just the hover states, there's like another layer of data here, right? So if I go to the buy box and I click this, here's all the current offers. And what's nice is I know, okay, this person's in the buy box. This is me. We're not in the buy box. It's red, but I know where I am price wise. We're matching. That's fine. Probably rotating. And if I click on any of these IDs, I can actually go straight to that seller and know exactly who it is, which is pretty amazing. And this is, we can turn on auto refresh and see all this stuff happening in real time here. So I can toggle on auto refresh. If it's very competitive, very high, rate of change, we'll see these things happen in real time. Additionally, if you need to jump over to the Amazon listing. We could do that here. You can see that all offers from that drop down as well. So you get this little, we call them the meatballs, you call them kebabs. We like to have names for all these little elements, but here's a good drop down here to go, find exactly what you need. And if you have this listing on other marketplaces or different SKUs with the same ASIN, you can see these broken down here, and we can actually just toggle between all of them, which is pretty great. So hopefully that helps a lot. There's a lot of good stuff there, and more to come. Definitely more to come. Big C, I was prepping. Always prepping. We were just talking about prep centers, and I see you on Twitter looking for a prep center, though. Hopefully, you can find you one. Hamburger menu. We also, we call it hamburger menu. We have, if you notice the little notifications when you take actions, it's like, we did that. We call that a toast because it comes up, it goes back down. Toasts are wonderful. Let's see here. John, good question here to wrap up on. Not sure if this has been covered, but does Maven reprice differently if I'm competing against Amazon, especially when Amazon tends to dominate the buy box? Casey, you want to hit that?
Sorry, I was looking at some of the other comments. Not sure if maybe, especially when Amazon tends to dominate the buy box. Yeah. So in terms of Maven's logic there, John, it's going to focus on a combination of sales velocity and margin. Obviously, buy box ownership is a part of that. It won't specifically take any different action because it is Amazon. It'll more so focus on the overall health or overall offers of a specific listing. So in this case, it would treat Amazon as a typical seller, but it would recognize that if Amazon's dominating the buy box, it would recognize that buy box price, how frequently that is the price that the buy box is won at. So it will take into account all of those different factors. It just won't specifically behave differently because it is an Amazon sold listing, if that makes sense there. Hopefully that was clear. Yeah,
great answer. So we've got a few more minutes here. Any follow-up or additional questions that anybody has, we're more than happy to go into those as well. It's a good one here, actually, from John.
Yeah. And I think that is the best way to, if you're looking to specifically behave, or when Amazon is competing on the listing, rule-based will be your best option there, John. Under the pursuit section, you have the ability to customize how you want to price against Amazon. If that rule-based strategy is only targeting the buy box, it will only target the buy box winner. So that will only come into account if Amazon's winning the buy box. But yeah, if you are competing with Amazon on a lot of your listings, rule-based may be a little bit more advantageous if you're looking to approach that listing a little bit differently, as opposed to Maven just searching for that optimized or best sales velocity price.
Yeah, nice. Great. Awesome answer there. So cool. We're going to start wrapping up here for time. Thank you everyone for joining us on this week's office hours. Again, we do this every single week, Wednesdays, 2 p.m. EST. It's a good time for us to be able to dive into these kind of questions at scale and answer them at scale, right? We were talking about scale at the beginning of this conversation. We typically start these off with one particular topic just to kind of get the gears turning. And what tends to happen is about halfway through, we kind of switch gears over to talking about Aura, how to do certain things, what to do in certain situations. So obviously don't feel like you have to wait to ask us questions. We're always available. That blue dot in the bottom right of the application, click that. You can talk with Casey directly with any questions you have. But again, we appreciate everybody joining us here. So have a great one.
See you next week, folks.